Hey everyone, welcome to tonight's broadcast. We're discussing Saints, the Standard of Truth, and we are on chapter 15. And tonight we have some special guests. Richie Stedman, how are you?
Richie T. Stedman, and I'm fantastic. Thank you for asking.
Wonderful. And we also have Jenny Dye. Jenny, how are you?
Jenny Noonan Dye, and I am just mediocrely okay.
That's right.
Jenny I'm really great, thanks.
Jenny is in the upstairs bedroom, and so we're going to start your office. I'm sorry, your office. And you know what? Ladies first, we're going to have you introduce yourself, please.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'd love to, John Dye. My name is Jenny Dye, and bios are my least favorite thing, as I have said on this broadcast several times. I work in social media, and I work as a fitness instructor, and I am a podcaster as well.
Oh, yeah?
Mormon, yes. For the Mormon News Report podcast, as well as The Cultural Hall. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Of theculturalhall.com? It's a show, isn't it?
It is a show in podcast form. Is what I like to call it.
Right.
Those are the.
Richie, tell us a little bit more about the Cultural Hall.
Well, my name is Richie T. Stedman, and one of the founders of theculturalhall.com. Not only a show available in podcast form, but it is also a community of people who just love being Mormon and want to talk about everything about being a Latter-day Saint. And yes, intentional in saying they love being a Mormon, and yes, they want to talk about what it means to be a Latter-day Saint. So it's all things. It's all inclusive, and we talk about everything. It's been around for about 7.5 years. You can find it at theculturalhall.com, and that's how I know all of you all from that. So thank you for letting me be here.
Awesome. Well, good to have you. Good to have you. Okay, guys. So good to be had. Okay, guys, chapter 15. Where do we want to start? This had quite a few, I think, key and meaty elements to it. Richie, do we want to start with you?
Sure, we can. As I was sort of looking through it, and I actually took notes. I'll show you just so you don't think I'm making that up. Look, I've got notes and everything.
Awesome. Hey, sorry, I'm going to stop you because I'm going to put this picture up. Tell us a little bit about this picture.
Aww.
That was 2 years ago, wasn't it? 3 years.
It's 3 years this coming Wednesday.
Was it really? You're a date girl. I forget.
Yeah, I'm a dates person.
So what is this? What is this, Mr. Stedman?
That is the sneak preview of a film called Christmas Eve, I want to say. From left to right as we look at it. That's me in 30 years on the far left. Also known as my dad, Kerry, Kerry, Kerry Stedman. And then there's me. And then, I'm the people in the middle, vaguely familiar, but names aren't coming. No, I'm just joking. I'm teasing, Jenny. It's President and Sister Oaks, and then Jenny, and then John. And the reason why President and Sister Oaks were there was because their daughter, Jenny Oaks Baker, was in the movie Christmas Eve, along with Patrick Stewart, or should I say Sir Patrick Stewart.
Sir Patrick, he has been knighted. That's correct.
Yep.
That's correct. Well, good. Yeah, that was one of the first times I think we all met one another. So that was fun.
Yeah, that's the first picture that exists of John Dye and me. Not married that day.
Yep.
Not married.
Strangely enough, not the first picture of me and my dad, and also not married that day.
Not married that day. That's right.
Yeah. That's right. My dad was. I wasn't. Forget it.
Yep. Getting a little deep. Hey, tell us what you liked about the chapter.
Well, we'll get into some of the stuff I really liked about the chapter later, because I feel like we're probably going to go chronologically as we work our way through it. But the chapter opens up with Phoebe Peck, which, she's sort of this adopted member of the Knight family because of relations and all this stuff. But the thing that I really loved is how chapter 15 starts. It's Phoebe and her 3 kids who have just come to Kirtland, have joined the church, and she is just a bold lady as she's talking to her friends that are back in New York and saying, hey, you know what? I wish for you to be a part of this. I'd like for you to come and feel the joy and the love that I have in what I'm doing. And one of the quotes that I wrote down is, she asks that if you ever get the opportunity to learn about these things, that you'll consider them with a careful and prayerful heart. And I really like that. It's just simple, but consider these things with a careful and prayerful heart was one of the first things I wrote down about this chapter.
Yes. Jenny, any thoughts?
I love that her 3 children, were part of a group of 11 children who were the first. They were kind of like all baptized the same day in Missouri. And I think that's really cool. It made me think of when my brother and sister got baptized. It was the 2 of them plus another brother and sister plus another friend. So 5 friends all got baptized the same day. But I just thought that was really cool and like a neat place in history to be a part of that group.
Yes. Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Well, some things that, I'll just bring up really quickly. We know that William Phelps had just recently published in the Evening and Morning Star, section 76, which was the 3 degrees of glory. And we know that many of the church members didn't take that extremely well. Therefore, the tar and feathering that happened in the previous chapter. But we know that Phoebe, like you said, Richie, shared it with a lot of her friends. And she said this as well. Could you but see and believe as I do, the way would be open and you would come to this land and we should behold each other and rejoice in the things of God. So again, to your point, Richie, just very bold in declaring the gospel and being able to share that with her friends. So pretty cool.
Yeah. This chapter, I think, pretty interesting, especially when you realize the sections that are received or at least mentioned within this chapter. The Oath and Covenant of the Priesthood in 84, the everything about the Civil War in 87, and then just sort of precursor, as I'm sure we'll get into it later, but also the word of wisdom within this chapter. So within this one chapter of saints, it's like here's a good portion of what we still do and believe and everything today, just like heaped of the big parts for sure.
Absolutely. Good thought there. Well, let's move on a little bit. Let's talk about Joseph and Newell going to New York City, and they had to go there because they were making purchases for what they call the United Firm. And it says the prophet had felt an increasing urgency to preach the gospel and build up the gathering place of the saints. What are some things that happened that stood out to you guys that happened when they were in New York City that you might want to talk about?
You want to go first, Jenny?
Yeah, thanks. So Newell was called to, like you mentioned, to kind of be the purchaser of the things for the United Firm. And I think it's interesting because they went to New York City. Joseph had never seen anything like it in his life, just all the, like his description of the tall buildings and the people who just kind of seemed to not care about one another or care about the gospel. He found it very off-putting. And so whereas he would go often back to the hotel room to meditate and pray and learn, Newell was doing what the Lord had called him to do. And I think that's, often I think we are given callings and we feel like we are not qualified. And sometimes that's the case, as we would say that the Lord qualifies whom he calls. But other times it really is something where even from a logical standpoint, it completely makes sense. He knows how to do this. And so that's what he's going to do. And that is what he did.
Yep.
Greatest city in the world.
Greatest city in the world. Yes.
The greatest city in the world. New York.
It's the greatest city in the greatest city.
Greatest city.
All right, Richie, add to it. What did you think?
So here is what I loved about this part of Joseph going to New York there's a part in there right after it mentions the Doctrine and Covenants section 84 where he talks about how he's homesick. So I think within the church we think of Joseph Smith, the mighty speaker, and that he's gone for weeks and months at a time, and he's just off doing the Lord's work, and we sort of put him on that pedestal, which, okay. But we don't often get that very human side of it, that at home is his, as it's mentioned in that chapter, I think it says very pregnant wife or something like that. And he misses her very much. He knows that he's doing the Lord's work, but he is missing her to the point of being homesick and just wishes to be back with her. And that to me, that really stuck out for some reason. I think we think of, I was also listening today to Elder Eyring's talk, where he's talking about how he goes and visits his wife in the hospital who can't even speak from just this last general conference, right? And that he loves his wife more than anything in the world, and that he knows that what he's doing is the calling of the Lord. But you got to know, as we know from when he gets emotional and caught up in his emotions, that's hard. And I think that we forget that human side of these whom we call. And so having this application there, and then being able to relay it back to what I listened to from Elder Eyring this morning, it's like these are ministers of God, but also people with real emotions.
Humanized, right? They're definitely humanized. And that's what I love about Saints, is it shows us, the brethren and the sisters and people just going through things. And I think adding some meat to that framework that, the skeleton that we've known since we were kids when we hear some of these stories. But the one thing I wanted to add, I think you guys hit most of it, but the Lord had specifically called Newell to warn people in large cities of the calamities. So Joseph actually went kind of as, I won't say a junior companion, but the Lord had called Newell Whitney to go do this, which was interesting. Again, he had the store, he had all these other things that he was supposed to do, but he was specifically called to do that, which I thought was very, very interesting as they went through that. Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about coming back to Kirtland and meeting one Brigham Young. Let's start with you this time, Richie. What stood out in that section for you?
Oh, Jenny had already breathed. Let her go.
Oh, Jenny, you get it first.
Well, okay, John Dye can attest to this. When we were listening to it, I was like, record scratch. Brigham Young's from Central New York? And John Dye said, I thought he was from Canada. And I said, I thought he was from England. Turns out,
I thought England.
He was born in Vermont. What?
Vermont?
Vermont.
It must be nice up there this time of year. All that cool mountain air and that snow.
Isn't that White Christmas?
I don't know what you're referencing. I don't know what that is.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, we're going on.
Different commercial. So he's born in Vermont, but he and his brother and their friend Heber Kimball, they had recently joined the church in Central New York. And just for some context, I believe Brigham joined the church in 1832, and he had been a Methodist, but then after reading the Book of Mormon, took an interest in the church, and he was a missionary in northern Canada, or I think it said upper Canada is what I read. So, John, I think that's where you got that connection to Canada. So he joined the church, but then he also he had a desire to get to know Joseph, and it just kind of talks about their first meeting when Joseph was out chopping wood, and just the differences. And Brigham could tell that Joseph was someone who really knew how to work with his hands. He was chopping wood, setting down his axe. Joseph shook Brigham's hand. "I am glad to see you," he said. I think that's just a nice first greeting between these two. So that's my thoughts for now. Richard?
I don't have anything to add on that particular thing.
Yeah, I'll add just a few things. This was interesting. I think we had some aha moments, as you had mentioned, Jenny. It's interesting that many of these people, this is, I think, the second or third time in this saint's book that we read before people joined the church. They wanted to know the industriousness, and they really wanted to know the people, who they were, specifically the prophet himself and Hiram many times. And so many times, as you can imagine, again, this was just a small but somewhat burgeoning religion. And so they would go straight to his house, and as he was splitting wood, literally he had just returned. And if I remember correctly, Emma had just given birth to Joseph Smith III, it talks about. Yes, just a few days earlier. So again, Joseph and Newell were in New York City. Here is Emma giving birth to Joseph Smith III after this horrific incident where they were tarred and feathered, and they lost one of the twins, exactly, in the previous chapter. So it talks about in this chapter, though, like Brigham, he, meaning Joseph, had come from a humble background, but he was not crude the way some laborers were. Brigham knew at once that he was a prophet of God. So sometimes just meeting Joseph was enough to really tip the scales and help people that were maybe on the fence. Now, Brigham was already a member because he'd been preaching from the Book of Mormon since he was baptized. But I think sealing the deal by meeting Joseph in person was a huge, huge thing. The other thing that I'll add is following the meal. So after Joseph was splitting wood, he invited these brothers.
Oh, sure. So now we're going to get into this. See, I just punted their meeting. I wasn't punting the whole Brigham Young thing.
It's all you. It's all you. Take it.
Go for it.
All right. So they retire to a meeting where there's a bunch of people gathered, and Brigham is the first one to start praying and is blessed with the gift of tongues, right? And it says that he's the language spoken of by Adam in the Garden of Eden, and that Joseph then joins him. And we hear that today, and I think if we heard that in like our chapel today, we'd be like, oh, okay. But, it's just such an interesting change of times, but commonplace back in the early days of the church. And Joseph joins him, and that confirms to him that Brigham is, a man of God as well. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Jenny, do you want to add anything there?
Just that I think that, the gift of tongues is such an interesting thing. The chapter specifically talks about, like Richie said, that at that time it wasn't really uncommon. And the chapter says the people who were in attendance had seen many people mimic the gifts of the Spirit with wild behavior. So this kind of like performance of what they thought, like, oh, I'm doing whatever, and like being overcome with the Spirit. But what Brigham did was different. And I am a believer that the gift of tongues these days manifests itself as missionaries learning foreign languages so quickly.
Yeah, very much so. There has to be some usefulness, right? I think sometimes it's utilized to confirm someone's faith. I think that this was the case because the only two that could probably understand it were Brigham and Joseph. And who knows? I don't even know if Brigham could understand it or what he knew about it. But I think that's a spiritual gift, as you said, that is many times manifest today in the lives of our missionaries as they learn, second and sometimes third languages so quickly.
It's an interesting thing, though, because I think people today also still seek that confirmation of who these people are. And so it is at least a cause for pause for a second where you think, okay, well, they had it back then. How come we don't see anything like that today? Missionary work is sort of like that. But within our meetings where everyone is able to speak the same language, how come we don't see that way? And I don't think that we're going to find an answer necessarily, but if, same yesterday, today, and forever, it does leave you that cause to pause and be like, well, have I ever experienced it and maybe didn't notice it? Have I ever experienced it and just not been open to it? Or is it because we live in a society now where we don't have the faith to be able to accept that we sort of eliminate our opportunity to even have that blessing?
Probably that one.
Yeah, probably 3.
Probably C. Yeah. That's a great question, though. Why don't we see this maybe manifest more in our time and have some things? We know, Jenny, you alluded to, people swinging from chandeliers, being taken by the gift of tongues, and
why don't we do that anymore?
Well, Richie,
or just kind of convulsing, kind of what the way I envision it is kind of like, oh, well, I've heard that people do this when they're overtaken by the Spirit, or they're speaking the gift of tongues, and so people, they act it out, but it isn't really accurate as far as what, like, it isn't genuine, it's an act. So but this, again, what Brigham did was different.
Yes, that was very interesting. Now we move on to the Civil War piece. Who wants to start with that?
So the thing that I took away from it, I mean, we obviously know about that, right? Probably one of the more prophetic sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, as far as like, I see in the future this thing happening. I can think of a few other examples from the Doctrine and Covenants and from church history, except for, I mean, like, so specific kind of things, right? It's interesting that the prophet Joseph Smith says South Carolina, and it's a time, and I know that from some historical things that I've studied, I know that like, it wasn't like it was an idea out of nowhere that the South would secede, right?
Right.
I think sometimes we read it and we go, 25 years, he must have, been able to pull that out of nowhere, and that wasn't the case. But to be that specific and to prophesy of it in the piece with South Carolina certainly is an attribute of the fact that, being prophetic in the name of God. The only thing I really wrote down about that was the fact that, the Civil War didn't begin until 1861, and Joseph Smith prophesied it in 1832 in section 87. So 29 years, that's pretty good. It's pretty spot on. And I always am sort of impressed by that, both by the Spirit and just by the prophetic nature of doing that. Like, I wonder what the point of, I always kind of wonder that, right? Because the saints then, it wasn't as if they could stop it, nor did they stop it. So was it gather ourselves and be ready? Was it hey, this is coming unless we repent? But they didn't. Like, my mind sometimes kind of wanders into what was the need for that, and did we do it or did we not do it? Whatever we were supposed to do.
Yeah. Interesting. Jenny, your thoughts?
I think it's interesting that what got Joseph to consider these things, as it's written in the chapter, it says that the local paper had published reports about the government leaders in South Carolina, and that some people were calling for war. And so Joseph, so this report was made. Joseph read the report and then reflected on the wickedness and destruction that the Bible said would precede the Savior's second coming. So it wasn't simply, like Richie said earlier, sometimes we think of the prophets of these just men who have no problems ever and are just out there, with strength, preaching the word and receiving revelation. But this, as we've seen in other chapters as well, requires the faith of the prophet and work and thought to know, like, what's going on in the world and what the Lord has to say about it. I think that that's really important, because while revelation is, of course, important and something that we are that we can receive for ourselves, it's also important to think through and become educated on matters in our lives. And that leads me to another point, unless you have like the next point about the tobacco and whatnot, which leads me to, so as they're having these meetings, where was it, in the store?
Are you talking about the School of the Prophets?
The school, yeah.
Yep. In the upper floor of the Newell K. Whitney store.
Okay. So that's where the church leaders are meeting. And after these meetings, Emma would come in to clean up after it. And these men would use tobacco. And so I totally just skipped a whole thing, didn't I? A whole section.
No, go ahead.
Organized.
You're fine.
You go right
All right.
ahead.
Well, okay. Well, I'll just say, so she's, she would watch people come in for the School of the Prophets and saw like how well prepared they were. How many men just kind of dressed to their night. They wanted to, as we often do, like for the temple, we want to present ourselves the best way we can. People came prepared. They would often skip breakfast, so they would be fasting. However, tobacco use in that day was something that was very, very common, including among the people who were going to these meetings. And so after the meetings were done and the people would leave, the floorboards were covered in tobacco spit. And tobacco stained really severely. And so she would just scrub and could not get it clean. And she went to Joseph and was like, this is gross and super difficult to keep up with. Joseph himself, here's what it says. Are you ready? Joseph did not normally use tobacco, but he didn't mind if other people did. I think there are two parts of that sentence that we could learn a lot from. Not just that he didn't always use it or normally use it, but that he didn't mind if other men did. I think those are two things that we would be well to think on. But then as Joseph went to about it, that's where we get to talking about the beginnings of what will inevitably become the Word of Wisdom, section 89. And of course, Emma wasn't alone in her concerns throughout the world, smoking, drinking. At the time, smoking and tobacco and drinking were thought to maybe be the cure of many things. And so again, Joseph took this to the Lord, and he was given the word of wisdom, not just about what to refrain from, but also emphasizing a healthy diet, encouraging grains, herbs, and fruits, and meat sparingly. And then the big elephant in the room of this chapter. Joseph did not insist on strict conformity because this was not given as commandment, but as a caution. He continued to drink alcohol occasionally, and he and Emma sometimes drank coffee and tea.
So was that a bit of a revelation to you?
Not to me.
Yeah.
Well, but I think
for a lot of people.
That's what I was looking through to find that line about how Joseph didn't insist on conformity. I really, that age-old thing of, teach them correct principles, etc. Like I think you see a large difference between Joseph and Brigham Young in that thing. I think that's where you see a large difference just in preference as far as how people should be. And in addition to that, I mean, I think that it in some ways needed to be different, right? Joseph didn't have to lead saints, 1,000 miles, and they didn't have to have those things exactly. Whereas the exactness needed to be observed in order to have those saints even be alive, but also just in temperament, that Joseph wasn't a man of strict conformity, but was of a man of like, hey, you know what? This is what you should probably be doing.
Yeah, for sure. And it's important to note that the beginning, what immediately precedes that in that sentence was about Joseph not insisting on strict conformity, was many people would find it hard to give up using these powerful substances. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of this idea where if it were a commandment, immediately think of how many people would be in violation of obeying the commandments.
Right. So before we get away from the School of Prophets, and I'm sure we're going to start wrapping this up, one of the things that I think is a unique instance, if you want to go back, John, to the picture of the School of the Prophets, if you can do that. I know you can bring these photos up. The actual room. That one right there. So it talks about like 20 or 30 men in there. And another thing that I thought was interesting as you read in Saints is it it talks about the covenant that the men in the school of the prophets made with each other, both to learn and with the Spirit. And so I find that interesting because of personal experience. So I served my mission in the Cleveland, Ohio mission, which takes in Kirtland. And missionaries who serve in the Cleveland, Ohio mission, which now no longer exists, it's been blended into something else, you get on your first day the opportunity to go here to the Newell K. Whitney store into the School of the Prophets, and they leave you there for as much time as you need, and they allow you the opportunity to covenant with God about how your mission will be. If you're willing to work hard, if you're, you know what I'm saying, just to be able to kind of open that that mission experience up in prayer. They take you from the airport to the Newell K. Whitney store up to the School of Prophets, and no tours are going through or anything like that. You're just there alone in your thoughts. You can have a journal, whatever it is. And that's also the very last thing that you do before you leave the mission as well. You go to the School of the Prophets, to the Whitney store up in the room, and it's like a report back. And it was interesting, just the weeping and the tears that you would hear from, you know, for all intents and purposes, I guess missionaries, at least a couple of them who I'd known, had gone in with really great intentions and had not fulfilled perhaps all of their calling. Maybe I'm projecting, but I think that, you know, that they related that same thing back to me. But just having that experience in that very sacred room to have that that communion with God, it's pretty special, and not a lot of people got to do it. But it's interesting. I'm not sure if they still do it, but that was something that we did when I served. Interesting. Right?
That is it, and it is a small room. I was there with
That's
my
cool.
and it is tightly packed, right? If you had 30 to 40 men in there, that is wall to wall. That's kind of crazy. One other thing that I'll just bring up really quick is washing the feet of the brethren. Joseph invited Orson, who was one of the main teachers, guess you could say, Orson Hyde in the School of Prophets, and he followed Christ's example, as it says here. He knelt before them one by one and washed their feet. So I think that's kind of cool. He says, it says, when he finished, he said, "As I have done, so do ye." He asked them to serve one another and to keep themselves clean from the sins of the world. So that's kind of cool what you were able to do on your mission. That's pretty cool.
I want to mention something else too about just because I saw a comment that you shared, John, that someone mentioned, you know, that, yeah, it wasn't a commandment, but the exactness is what is important. And that's true. Yeah. Merritt Welker says exactness is so important, as it wasn't a commandment, yet it wasn't essential. And I want to point out that after that paragraph where people go, "What? Joseph and Emma drink coffee and tea." The next paragraph said, "Still, after Joseph read the words to the School of the Prophets, the men in the room tossed their pipes and plugs of chewing tobacco into the fire to show their willingness to obey the Lord's counsel." And I think that's a really good example of a willingness to be obedient, but also a willingness to learn. In my mind, I just kind of think of it's like, oh, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to be doing this. Yeah, no problem. Just take it. I won't do it anymore. And so often when we maybe think about other people making choices, it might just be that they don't even know. And so anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, good thought.
One last pickup for me. I was just going to say, and it's just a quick note. I think it's interesting to know that in the School of the Prophets that the men weren't just learning about spiritual things and receiving revelations, but also that was where grammar was taught and arithmetic. So it was a literal, in that case, school for a lot of these people. And Orson Hyde, if I remember, Orson Hyde was the one who traveled to Jerusalem, right, and dedicated the place where the BYU Center is.
Yes, the hill is not far from the BYU Jerusalem Center.
Yep.
And yeah, he is indeed the one, Orson Hyde.
Yep.
And what's interesting about Orson, though, is he was a
orphan.
Orphan. I was going to say, what's it called when you don't have parents? He was an orphan.
My life.
And so he was an orphan, and so the fact that he wasn't able to be schooled himself, except during, after the fall harvest and when he had to prepare ground, he did a lot of this as an adult. But they taught, they taught all these languages, and it was amazing. It's something that I think is pretty darn cool.
Yeah. They got BYU Utah football game day off back in the day, though.
They did. Yeah.
But BYU doesn't count it because it was BYA. It's a thing. I looked that up yesterday. It has nothing to do with this book, but I don't know what that's about.
Okay. All right.
Now there's a library there.
Yep.
Now there's a library. And Merritt corrected us. He dedicated the land of Israel, Orson, but in the Garden of Gethsemane, not on the hill where the Jerusalem center is. So I actually didn't go to the point where he dedicated or where the marker is, but it's right around that general area. The Garden of Gethsemane is right down the hill from where BYU Jerusalem is. Okay, I think we're almost done as we talk about the Kirtland Temple.
Learning how to build a temple. Mm-hmm.
Let's do that. Jenny, do you want to start us out?
Okay. Maybe I should have had that pulled up. Okay, so Joseph was looking for ways, always looking for ways to fulfill the Lord's commandment to build Zion. And so just kind of like, okay, how can we do this? How can we do this? And so in praying for that, they saw a vision of the temple, learn what it would look like. And it looked like a church from the outside, like a drawing was created. Outside, it would look like a large church, but inside they would have two spacious assembly rooms, one on the upper floor, one on the lower floor. And then also we learn about the plan for creating a city, right? Because in Zion, it was building way faster than they thought. And so with the help of Frederick and Sidney, Joseph drew up plans for this, and it was a 1 square mile city. So long, straight streets and grid pattern. That sound familiar? With brick and stone houses, with the groves of trees in the front and then garden space in the back. Everyone got a half acre, no matter their station. So like rich people, poor people, everyone got the same amount. In the city center were the temples and the public buildings. People worked in the cities, but like lived kind of like farther out. One thing that I thought was interesting, each public building was to be inscribed with the words "Holiness to the Lord." I mean, we see that on the temples, but it said every building. So, anyone?
So why don't we have it on church buildings is what you're asking?
Because we have visitors. Welcome.
I thought it was interesting that it would be like that holiness to the Lord would be on every building. Isn't that what it said?
Yeah, that it
Each
should
public
be on
building
every
would
building.
be inscribed with the word holiness. So what I'm saying is take your Sharpie. No, don't do that. But just like an interesting idea that every single building have that, just kind of like as a reminder that this is a city that the Lord has designed, and just kind of as a reminder. I mean, because we often talk about that, right? That the words "holiness to the Lord" are on temples, so that we'll be reminded that whose house it is when we enter. Just think of what we would be reminded of walking into any building, walking into work, walking into the bank, just kind of like, what is my purpose living in this city? That it would be holiness to the Lord.
That's interesting too, because they considered, I remember them talking about this, and it may be in Independence as well, but each of the buildings would be considered a temple. And so when you hear about Temple Square, that was the main point in Salt Lake City where everything was supposed to go around that. Of course, we have the edifice of the temple, but smaller temples would surround that. And that was the original vision, I believe, for Kirtland and Independence when Joseph put those together. Richie, any thoughts there?
So it's not part of the chapter, so I'm going to go tangentially for a minute. this again from the experience of being in Kirtland. There's a gentleman by the name of Artemus Millet who people can look up, and if you go do the tour in Kirtland, it talks about how Artemus is a convert of the church who provided the method to the saints for building the exterior wall construction. And what people don't know is that at the time, the Kirtland Temple would have been one of the tallest buildings in the state of Ohio, and certainly one of the tallest churches, right? Being that there's 3 floors. So if you look in the picture, there is the main floor, which you would go in, and that's where church services would have. There's the upper floor, and then there is an even upper floor where the School of the Prophets ends up getting moved to. So it's essentially 3 stories, and then you have the bell tower and so on. So to have constructed a building this tall and in this time, it is essentially revolutionary. We look at it now and then think about Joseph going to New York and think of these 200-story buildings, and we go, no big deal. But it was it was of an amazing constructural feat at this time. So this gentleman, Artemus Millet, not mentioned in Saints, but it is fascinating to know that Brigham Young baptized him in Canada. There's some discrepancy as to whether or not he was baptized before he started working on the temple or after, and I don't know that it matters one way or another. But that method without him perhaps could not have been done. So it just shows yet again the way that the Lord through his servants would help find these people to be able to accomplish these things, so that they could be done for a tribute to the Lord.
Yeah, that's great. Good.
Tangent, sorry.
Tangential information. No, that's good. That adds to it. A couple things that interested me here as we wrap this up, but the city, Kirtland, was planned to accommodate 15,000 people. Obviously much smaller than New York City, but also much larger. I think it said it would be by far one of the largest cities in the country. And one other thing I wanted to bring up is the olive leaf revelation. This is slightly different, but much of this with the temple didn't occur until this was resolved. So many people in Missouri were kind of upset that the prophet was staying in Kirtland after he had named, Missouri as the gathering point and the gathering place for the saints. And we know he sent Edward Partridge and others out there to get it ready. And as we all know, they didn't think it was the most accommodating space for what they were trying to do. It wasn't the best space per se. And so many of the Missourian saints, the saints in Missouri, started to rebel and have some issues with Joseph and the leadership. And the olive leaf revelation was something that was created to kind of pacify them, to help them understand what was happening. And right before we read about all this temple construction and the vision that Joseph had for the temple, Edward and others had urged the saints, after they read the olive leaf revelation, to repent and to reconcile those saints in Missouri, to reconcile with the church in Kirtland. So you kind of have to get your own house in order, and we did read about that. Get your house in order before you can actually do more things. And we see that was the case before they could even start thinking about the temple in Kirtland, is they had to have the saints become reunited. And we lost Miss Jenny, but she is coming back here. Jenny, we lost you.
And now I'm found.
You are found. You are found.
That's again just proving that once was lost, but now is found. Was blind, but now she sees.
What about now?
That is true. That is true. Mr. Richard T. Stedman. Any last thoughts as we take off here soon?
I'm interested particularly in the coming of it as the exodus from Kirtland. I am not reading ahead as the weeks go on, so I'm interested to see what I'll pick up nugget-wise as the church makes its way more west, and as it leaves Kirtland, what kind of things that I sort of pick up in that, both in the trials and in what they mention specifically about like the Kirtland Bank, to see if there will be anything about that. Kirtland is such a fascinating time in church history for me. anything about it, I will just devour.
Yeah, the Kirtland Safety Society is just very, very interesting. That whole episode, very, very interesting. Hey, Miss Jenny, what other thoughts do you want to leave us with before we sign off?
This is just it's a chapter with a lot of really big things that we talk about even today. And so thanks everyone who's joined us. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks, Richard, for being here with us today as well.
Thank you for inviting me. Next time I expect Reese's. So there's that.
I don't know what that is.
There is Reese's. There is Reese's.
JK.
Yes, don't know where, but there's Reese's somewhere. So we will depart the same way we came in, with the picture from almost 3 years ago. 3 years ago this Wednesday. One of the first times Jenny and I saw each other in person, with President and Sister Oaks. And there's
I just barely got this photo developed. That's why it took so long. I had to take the film to Walmart and get it developed. So
in your disposable camera, right?
Yeah, I don't know what that means. What does that mean?
I picked up a Reese's while I was there. Good night, kids.
Good night. All right, guys. So join us next week, chapter 16, and comment below. Let us know where you're watching from, and also any comments you may have about the chapter as we went through it. All right, signing off, guys. Have a good night.
Saving a seat for you.
Back seat.
Back row.
Back row.
Different thing.
Mormon